And I've had a few comments about people asking me what is the type of sand that I use and how is it actually made. So I thought I'd give you the quick recipe that I actually use, and hopefully that'll help people out if they're trying to actually do it. The sand that I use is basically just a dry builder's sand. The reason why I actually use that is this particular sand is washed and desalinized. You don't want any salt content in the sand. You don't want to go and use something like beach sand, because the salt and the sodium actually adds to the recipe and it can make it very bubbly, and it can even be quite explosive. The other components that I use is that one there, which is basically coal dust, okay, which actually helps get the finer detail in the actual component. The binding agent that I use is the clay powder, you can see there, which is a bentonite clay powder. You can buy it commercially, sort of thing. I actually am lucky enough that I have a founderer not too far away who sells me this stuff, but you can make it yourself, I believe, out of the clay clumping kitty litter, which is also made from the same sort of material. You'd have to crush it up into a powder for it to be actually able to be mixed, but that's essentially what the thing is. Okay, now obviously the primary ingredient is a silica sand. This is, I wouldn't say it's terribly coarse, but for the type of casting that I'm doing, it's not extremely fine. You can get a finer grade sand if you want to. The difference with that is you'll actually have to fiddle around a little bit with the mixture. It's called green sand. Green doesn't refer to the colour, it refers to the moisture content. So if you were talking about like a green tree branch, that's the reference in terms of what we're talking here. Normally for every casting that I do, probably every 3 castings I'll add probably a handful, just, you know, a small handful sort of thing, about that sort of much of the actual both the 2 components, just to boost the bit that gets burnt off in the actual sand. I will be adding this once it's mixed up to my original sand. You can already see some sand's actually been mixed in there, and it blackens off as it burns the coal components and as it burns the clay as well. But I'll give you a quick basis if you're starting from scratch on what the recipe roughly is. You can get online. I think Wikipedia, for instance, has got the exact mix recipes. I tend to do it more by eye and by feel, so that it actually clumps properly, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Okay, I've just pushed aside a small part of the bulk of the sand. Most of the sand is going into my old component there at the moment, starting to mix. But just to give you an idea, if you're actually starting from scratch, and this is why I say get the exact measurements if you want to, but I tend to eyeball it, because that sort of quantity of sand, okay, we're going to be looking at about that much. Now keep in mind, that's very, very fine, so that's spreading out a lot more. That's the coal dust, and probably just a little bit more in the clay. So probably 3 handfuls. Okay, now this is a bit like a cooking recipe, so that was probably more like 2.5 handfuls for that size. So like I said, I tend to eyeball this. I personally feel that needs maybe a little bit more sand, and it's just, I'm going by feel, just through experience, but that to me looks like about the right sort of recipe for what I'm actually doing. Now what we do now is basically dry mix that. Once it's dry mixed, we actually add the water and we do our first test. Okay, so I'm just dry mixing that through so that we end up with all those components mixed together. And you can see the colour change that you actually get there in the sand. But with that being a brand new sand, in comparison to the old sand, you can see that the burnt off stuff is significantly a darker colour. That will happen over time. Some people will proclaim that you throw the sand out over an extended period of time. I've used this sand many times and it hasn't been any issue. I've just constantly topped it up with new sand mixed in with the old. The only thing you want to do over time, in my opinion, is actually make sure that you top it up with the other ingredients and make sure that there's no particular contaminants in the sand as you go on. Okay, what we're going to do now is add the water, and this is quite literally like if you were cooking to a certain degree. You basically create a little well, bring the water in, and the consistency mix that you want to get is, I guess, you somewhere between a sandcastle sort of mix and something that's a bit drier than that. Whilst it is a wet sand, or as it says, green sand, it's not wet to the touch. I guess when you're talking about like this sort of consistency, that mud sort of consistency, that's way too wet. You don't want to be going for that sort of consistency at all. It's more of a very flaky consistency, so that it breaks away nicely in your hands. You just keep on working that in and breaking it up. Okay, so this is what I'm kind of doing now, is trying to get that water mixed consistently right through the sand so that there's no wet and dry areas, so that it's all consistent. You can see what I mean about it sort of flaking up and becoming a flaky sort of consistency. That's how you want it to be able to stay. So this is still not quite right yet, it's still a little bit wet. You want it to remain consistently enough so that when you start shaking it out into your mould, that it becomes flaky enough that it fills in all those little tight areas that you actually want. Okay, so we're getting very close to the right sort of consistency here. I would say that that's still a little bit wet. So as I said, this is why I'm talking about eyeballing it, and through experience you'll get it. I'm just going to add a sprinkle of sand just to dry that out a little bit more. And that's going to get pretty close to the consistency that we're after. Once you're fairly happy, or you think you're close to the right consistency, you need to give it a screening test. In my opinion, just drop it in your screen, idea like that, and just give it a sprinkle. If that's coming through, okay, and it's coming through like that sort of consistency, then that's pretty close. This is still a little bit wet, okay, so I'm going to go back and add a little bit more sand to it to dry it out a little bit more, but it should be screening through. And you see how this starts to ball, like get these ball up sort of things in it? That means that it's still a little wet. You shouldn't have to force it through the screen to get the detail. It should be coming out looking pretty much like that. Okay, the look of that is quite good. Okay, so the look of that is quite good, but it's still a little thick. So we're going to thin that down with a little bit more sand. The final test we're going to do in this is just a pressure test. You want it to basically hold the shape. So if that holds the shape of the hand quite nicely and it holds the shape, see how it cracks like that? That's what you want. The other way to do it is to get a good handful and give it a good squeeze like that, and it should hold that shape really nicely. Okay, you then want to give it a test and see if it breaks. If it breaks consistently like that, that's pretty much what we're looking for. You don't want to be in a situation where you try and break one and the whole thing collapses into a lump, okay, or into pieces. So providing you're getting that sort of thing that you can actually, again, this is what I was talking about, that sandcastle type sort of mixture. It's a drier mix than sandcastle sort of sand, but it has that breakaway aspect of it, so that it actually holds its shape nicely, forms a solid sort of lump, and doesn't just collapse. If you give that a squeeze, that's what you're after. You don't want it. It's all right for it to break, but you don't want it to just shatter into 1,000 pieces. Okay, there we go. Okay, so with a bit of time and a bit of working, that's the old and new sand mixed together. So that's essentially it. A couple of things I didn't mention. If you're going to be using the kitty litter, obviously make sure that you get the clay-based kitty litter, not that crystalline stuff. It will have to be crushed into a powder. You can, as a separating agent, like between the two halves of the mould, use common old cornstarch baby powder to actually do it. But what I do recommend you get, if you can find it, is powdered graphite, which is essentially exactly the same thing as you find inside a lead pencil. In a powder form, it's an inert type of thing. You should be able to order it online without an issue at all. But in a pinch, the baby powder will work fine.